Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Big pleasure to welcome so many of you from all around the world today to the global launch webinar of the 2023 edition of Bureau Veritas Global Energy Transition Report. My name is Jörg Meinbauer. I'm the Global Vice President for Power and Renewables at BV, and I'm truly honored and privileged to be your host today. In March this year, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published its latest assessment report, and the warning couldn't have been clearer. Just to cite a few statements, maybe the pace of scale of climate action are totally insufficient. Adverse impacts from human-caused change will intensify, and we are now really out of time. Now, the key message, though, said it can be done and it must be done. The world is in deep trouble on climate change, but if we really put our shoulder to the wheel, we can turn things around. So thank you to Frank Giotto and the team for giving us a little hope here. Still, we all know the speed of change required to turn things around and head off the worst disasters will need to be remarkable. And us, the energy industry, of course, sits at the eye of this storm. Whilst tremendous progress has been made, we know very well that the pace still isn't fast enough and that an enormous acceleration will be needed over the next years, or even more than that, probably about a month, to be able to achieve net zero in time. Removing barriers is the key focus for the energy transition to be able to reach its full potential. And this is what our report is all about. From February to April 2023, BV collected insights and opinions from over 800 market experts and industry leaders from all continents and corners of the energy sector. The outcome of this survey is the report we're going to launch today. It looks into the short-term barriers we need to remove to keep accelerating the energy transition and stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris target. So not what we need to accomplish by 2040 or maybe 2050, but really what we need to fix right now, this year or next year at the very latest. We investigated why, despite an apparent abundance of both private and public finance pouring into the sector, not enough projects are reaching ready-to-build stage at this point of time. Now, before we start with looking into the results of our investigation, let me please introduce my co-hosts of today's session. Please welcome here on the webinar Ulrike Zerhag. She's the Global Technical Director for Power and Renewables. Christian Alga, Global Director for Solar and Battery Energy Storage Systems. And Stefan Ciniselli, Global Director for Offshore Wind at BV. A little bit of housekeeping as for the format of this webinar. There will be, of course, a Q&A session at the end of this call. So please take notes. There's a box in the Teams call where you can put your question, and then at the end, depending on time allowance, we will answer as many as possible between the four of us. So let us start looking at the data. We start, as naturally, with the status quo. So we started our journey in the here and now to really understand where we are today with the energy transition, what is the mood in the industry, and how far respond believed we got already on our way to net zero. And some of those insights are really mind-blowing. First, let's look at the Paris Agreement. So we asked our audience whether the world can meet the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And the votes from our respondents were almost exactly split 50-50. So that's, from my point of view, not a really promising confidence level, and it draws through all the rest of the report. While over 90% of today's global economy is now covered by net zero targets, the scale of the challenge remains very ambitious. Only under 40% of power today is produced from low carbon sources, including renewables and nuclear. And it is estimated that an average annual spending on the energy transition needs to triple to $4 trillion to reach the Paris goals. An overwhelming 82% of the BV survey participants believe that the current strategy of boosting capacity growth in renewables is still the best way to cut global greenhouse emissions in the energy sector. And they also believe that the deployment will accelerate significantly towards 2030. However, many are only moderately optimistic that sufficient barriers will be reduced over the next 3 years, and only 38% believe that fossil fuels will be actually fully phased out by the year 2040. The economic incentive to invest in carbon-intensive options is still too strong. As we all know, money is always spent according to a return on investment. So with the majority of the world being really conscious of the need for change, what is holding the industry back? Surprisingly, the companies playing a key role in the energy transition, meaning the energy companies themselves, ourselves here, are often not far advanced in decarbonizing their own businesses. Over 40% from our 800 participants have no net zero plan in place today, and over 43% do not even know their full carbon footprint. This is, of course, of concern, as it endangers trust in the energy sector. Stakeholders need to trust that providers of green energy are themselves walking the talk. Our survey also explored the motivations behind corporate efforts to decarbonize. And almost half of participants said companies feel a moral obligation, which is good. And 57% named peer pressure due to disclosures in sustainability reports within the top 2 drivers. Regulatory and financial considerations were also cited, but to a much lesser degree with much less importance. So what is it then that is dragging down the pace of the energy transition so it becomes too slow for what we need to achieve to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius? But before we look at the 4 pillars, a word on finance. Finance pretty much always comes up when we talk about the transition. And indeed, 1 in 3 respondents in the BV survey also cited access to finance among their top concerns. At first sight, that seems completely illogical. Lack of finance is not a real issue in itself. Government and the private sector have promised massive investment in the energy transition in the coming decades. The real issue is that both public and private finance are competing for a project pipeline that is too small and too uncertain. The result is a 2.9 trillion shortfall in renewable spend, equivalent to the combined economies of Canada and Australia. So how can then more capital be unlocked? Most would recognize that access to finance stems from 2 factors: a stable regulatory context, which sends a positive market signal and project risk. The latter is of particular concern in developing economies where greater perceived risks of investment result in higher cost of capital. Since this is closely related to real and perceived project risks, identifying ways to reduce risk relating to safety, reliability, and performance on projects is a key way to improving access to finance and terms. In short, finance is not a critical issue for feasible projects. The key challenge is to accelerate the build-up and development of an enhanced project pipeline that meets all the necessary investment criteria to unlock equity and debt. For this reason, our report has not treated finance as a separate problem. Instead, we've been looking at 4 areas which you can see on this slide in order of importance: government policy and regulatory context, advances in technology, scaling up supply chains, and mobilizing a global workforce. In the following 4 sections, we will be exploring each of those 4 key areas for acceleration. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Christian for the first of those 4 building blocks.
Thank you, Jörg. The clear number 1, government policy is considered to have the biggest overall impact in accelerating the energy transition. The BB Global Survey highlighted multiple areas in which government policy can shape the pace of the energy transition. The top measure cited by respondents with 36% is fast-tracking of development and permitting. Over a third of respondents, if asked to choose only one measure, stated that simplifying permitting regulations and consultation mechanisms would do most to accelerate the energy transition. As known in the industry, regulators also need to find better balance between the rights of local communities and their ability to block projects. Leveling the playing field around carbon emissions came in second place. 1 in 4, or more than 25% of respondents' policy choices focused on harmonizing regulations worldwide so that emissions are measured rather than estimated. They also wanted to see global carbon pricing. No surprise here, half of respondents believe that accelerated investment in power grids would significantly drive the transition, with 1 in 10 citing it as their top concern. Power grids need to keep pace with development of renewable generation projects, which is not the case to date. This means that government should invest massively in infrastructure and update the mechanisms governing grid connections to avoid further delays. Finance comes in last place, both in terms of increasing availability of green finance and providing more fiscal incentives for new projects. The importance of market incentives can increase during periods of tightening monetary policy, like the one we're currently experiencing, to help ensure that higher borrowing rates do not impact new renewable energy project construction. Government, energy pricing, and financial incentives are seen as enablers, but crucially not as key accelerators for the energy transition. However, please allow me a few more words on permitting. Faster permitting comes top of developers' wish list when it comes to government policy measures, and with reason. Planning consumes the vast majority of time needed to develop a renewable project, with technical installation taking just a comparatively short few months. Proposals exist to accelerate project approvals. In Europe, for example, the one-stop shop for permitting introduced through the net zero industry is a pragmatic step forward. Experience from elsewhere, for example, the use of single windows for trade and customs, shows that one-stop digital solutions frequently speed up administration and reduce risk. Europe's objective is to get permitting for clean energy projects of more than 1 gigawatt down to 12 months. The Act requires the bloc's member states to set up one-stop shops that act as single points of contact for project promoters throughout the permit process and to issue a decision on time. However, to continue to shape public trust in renewable energy, it is important that any process put in place must be transparent and fair. Honest, accurate, and clear communication with stakeholders backed by thorough environmental impacts assessment and certifications will be essential. So talking about technology as number 2, fast-tracking development of new or existing technology is expected to have the second biggest overall impact in accelerating the energy transition. Advances in technology over the next decade will be key to reaching the Paris Agreement goals. An astonishing 40% believe current state-of-the-art technologies are unable to deliver 1.5 degrees Paris Agreement target at the required pace and cost. Not only that, but there's no magic wand. Industry insiders do not believe that 1 or 2 key technologies will make the difference. With the Paris Agreement targets getting closer and closer, we do not have the luxury of placing bets. Instead, technology development is a broad set of measures that all need to advance in parallel. The BD survey broadly reconfirms the common industry view. Over 80% of survey participants said they believe the energy transition will be almost entirely driven by capacity growth in renewables. For 69% of respondents, the development of green hydrogen projects at scale will be essential. The picture is less clear when it comes to nuclear. Around 44% of survey participants believe the energy transition will be supported by nuclear power, notably in the form of small nuclear reactors. However, a similar proportion disagree. Overall, attitudes toward nuclear reveal strong bias depending on the participant's country. Interestingly, gas, a major transition fuel, does not seem to be a primary concern to address for a majority of survey respondents. We all know this. For technology to be adopted, it must be trusted. However, gaining trust is complex when a technology is new, and the infrastructure and markets to support it do not yet exist. Despite strong belief in the potential of technology advances, challenges abound. Certain key technologies are far from being mature and have yet to be deployed at scale. Significant investment in R&D is still needed. For example, 83% of respondents state scalability, decreasing cost, and longer periods of battery storage will be key enablers to move on. Or for instance, 67% say that further innovation in energy storage is needed, as current technologies cannot be scaled up. This aligns to the fact that over 40% of respondents believe the energy transition requires significant scale-up of floating offshore wind and floating solar, as well as 70% believe that development of green hydrogen projects at scale is a key enabler for a successful transition. Finally, advances in technologies are also a major topic for downstream players. Half of our survey respondents see carbon capture as a way to cut CO2 emissions from hard-to-abate industries such as steel, cement, aluminum, and petrochemicals. Ulrike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, let's have a look at the next key area, which is scaling up supply chains. Accelerating the energy transition requires massive scale up globally and locally of reliable, diversified, and sustainable supply chains beyond anything seen before in the industry. And this is putting pressure on companies to source smartly. One of the most essential aspects to accelerating the energy transition is trust in supply chains. The entire value chain needs to be able to trust that developers are able to deliver on projects. And meanwhile, players at every stage of the manufacturing supply chain have to be able to source the right components and materials at the right time and in the right quantities with the right sustainability approach and, of course, at the right price. And all this has to be done at an immeasurably bigger scale than in the past or today. Obviously, this is easier said than done. The acceleration of the energy transition demands thinking in big numbers, multiples, rather than incremental growth. Double-digit growth in renewable technologies over the next 5 years requires a matching ramp-up in supply of components from both existing but also new suppliers, of course. And for this reason, participants in the survey named supply issues as the third largest obstacle in the energy transition. They identified multiple issues, both temporary but also long-term. Many, such as quality risks in the supply chain, are likely to significantly worsen in the next 4 years. Now, to secure both the global and local supply chain, companies need to adopt a proactive and detailed risk management approach. C-suite need to make sourcing and supply chain sustainability strategy priorities, thinking long-term and investing in supply chains. This means managing supply chain risk from availability and resilience, but also to pricing and sustainability, with as much care as the financial risk. Supply chain look likely to remain dynamic for years to come, and I think this is undoubted, with companies needing to continually select and onboard large numbers of new suppliers. They will also become more geographically diversified, which will demand ramp up in supplier scrutiny. And as a result, companies will need to invest more in dedicated personnel to carry out technical assessments, procurement support, as well as supplier audits, including, of course, ESG audits, or alternatively outsource the work to a reliable third party. The accelerated scale-up of the supply chain brings multiple serious challenges. First, it will result in a huge overall increase in the number of new suppliers in the chain. This will create challenges for project developers and manufacturers in terms of quality, safety, and sustainability, while going beyond ESG ratings. They will need to assess new suppliers precisely at a time when competition for components, materials, and services, everything from wind turbine blades and PV modules to engineering and technical support, is at its highest. Additionally, As supply chains ramp up, so will the need for local manufacturers of key clean energy components in line with countries' local requirements, as well as with other cost and economic factors. Now, this, in combination with a lack of local skilled workforce and experience, will surely create significantly quality, HSE, and other related risks that need to be mitigated. And of course, companies are already concerned. Around half cite supplier quality issues among their top issues, noting they lack resources to fully monitor their supply chain. 29% believe there simply are not enough high quality suppliers out there. Well, as such, ensuring quality will clearly be a pressing concern for companies when sourcing new suppliers. Procurement teams will have to invest significant time in identifying new suppliers, monitoring the quality of components coming out of their supply chain, whether from scale-up production from existing suppliers, but also from new suppliers. A proactive approach to improving reliability starts with skilled and trustworthy people on the ground at supplier, but also at loading sites to monitor new suppliers and essentially to reduce the risk of poor quality. Also important to note is that the supply chains for clean technologies are currently concentrated in just a few countries, with China being the undisputed frontrunner. The country handles 97% of the global manufacturing of wafers for PV modules and has 75% of the world's production capacity for battery cells. So, no surprise that over 30% of companies identify geographical concentration as their top supply chain issue. One of the obvious answers to this problem is to expand domestic production. And in this context, the United States and the European Union have created the necessary regulatory conditions to build clean technology manufacturing bases. In the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, promised $370 billion in tax credits to the renewable energy industry, of which $30 billion is expected to be allocated only to US manufacturing of PV modules, wind turbines, batteries, and critical minerals processing. Meanwhile, the Europe's Net Zero Industry Act sets an aim for manufacturing capacities to reach at least 40% of the deployment needs by 2030. That's incredible. The growing demand for renewables has also caused factory utilization rates to reach unprecedented levels without additional capacity and at the same time, without flexibility, but high dependence on few individual production hubs. Supply chains will remain more vulnerable to unplanned events. Sustainability and transparency are both increasingly key issues in renewable energy supply chains. Upstream supply chains have historically come with human rights risks. The mining of cobalt and nickel, both used in lithium-ion batteries, and copper, used in wind and solar assets, has been linked to human rights abuses. Growing awareness of issues such as child labor in some countries is forcing change. Regulations such as the German Supply Chain Act and the upcoming EU directive on corporate sustainability due diligence oblige companies to assess supply chains, formalize informal work arrangements, and enforce applicable labor standards. And this is likely to impact where supply chain investments are made and which suppliers are chosen. Environmental risks relate principally to resource extraction, use, and waste. Until recently, not all components used in clean energy projects were recyclable, and asset owners often chose or even had to dispose components in landfill as it was the cheapest option. Today, technology has evolved and big improvements have been made, but the industry has still a long and hard way to go to become fully circular. The BV survey shows that only 40% of companies today have an action plan to use recycled materials and recycle assets at end of life, while 16% have never considered the topic. And the industry is even less advanced on other and key environmental sustainability issues, only 20% have a plan to reduce embedded carbon in the manufacturing of components and assets, while under a quarter proactively consider the biodiversity impacts of their projects. C-suite leaders must remain vigilant to the strategic risks of supply chain sustainability. This means investing in supply chains and recruiting or upskilling employees regarding sustainability. Companies can also propel innovation to improve the sustainability of key components by adopting a collaborative approach with suppliers and through initiatives such as joint industrial projects. And ideally, these should include a broad range of players, from manufacturers, suppliers, and independent bodies, to develop workable solutions that inspire trust. And with that, I hand over to Stefan.
Thank you, Ulrike. Hiring and retaining qualified staff is an ongoing challenge that must be overcome to achieve the energy transition objectives. Engineers, technicians, construction workers, large numbers of people are required today and not tomorrow. 90 million people will be employed in the energy sector by 2030. That's 38% more than today. The biggest workforce-related challenge for the energy transition lies in the sheer quantity of people it requires, with growth in employment driven by total energy investment. The International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, estimates that over 38 million people globally could be employed in the renewable energy by 2030. Simply hiring and retaining people in those kind of numbers is already a major challenge. Finding the right people in the right place is an even greater one, considering the massive difference in market maturity between geographies. In Bureau Veritas Global Survey, respondents identified this as a very real issue for the energy transition. They specified recruiting engineers and technical staff, retaining qualified staff, and recruiting construction site workers in the right location as the top 3 obstacles in mobilizing the necessary workforce. Companies in the renewable energy sector will face the added hurdle of recruiting engineering, technical, and specialized construction staff at a time of rapid project ramp-up and strong competition for the same profiles. For example, in 2022, wind turbine technician was listed as the fastest growing job on LinkedIn. Employer demand for this role grew by plus 80% between 2020 and 2021. In addition, in the short to medium term, demand for jobs is geographically very uneven. Nearly 2/3 of all renewable energy jobs are located in Asia, with China alone accounting for 42% of the global total, again stressing the critical concentration of supply chains, as more than half of that is in manufacturing. It is followed by the European Union and Brazil with 10% each, and the United States and India with 7% each. Jobs in the energy sector are often highly skilled, whereas skilled jobs represent a quarter of all roles in the wider economy. Around 45% of energy workers are currently in this type of role. As the energy transition unfolds, training new workers and reskilling the existing workforce, many of whom have valuable transferable skills, will be essential to meeting future needs and keeping salary inflation under control. Indeed, this is seen as the top HR challenge by over 1/3 of companies who answered the Bureau Veritas survey. Engineers and technical staff are in particular demand, as an issue of key concern to more than 2/3 of respondents, and cited the #1 challenge by almost half. Reskilling workers is also a social imperative, as many existing jobs in fossil fuel industry are likely to disappear. To highlight that again, 67% say they're struggling to recruit engineers, technical staff, and construction managers with the right skills and experience. 40% see retaining talent in a competitive job market as a key challenge. And 30% see reskilling the existing workforce and the associated cost as a key challenge. The next decade will see millions of people undergo training to work in renewable roles. Industry bodies and governments will need to work together, both to promote renewable energy as an attractive career and to address the skill gap. Around the world, wheels are already in motion, however, more needs to be done. A ramp-up in new projects in various locations around the world inevitably places strain on managers, particularly when staff working on projects are recent hires. Managers face the challenge of ensuring that the right engineering resources are deployed to the right locations, something which becomes more complex with multiple projects. At the same time, they must guarantee that safety standards are respected by staff on the ground, which requires a strong safety culture and constant vigilance. Bureau Veritas Global Survey revealed that staff shortages are felt at every level, from project managers and engineers to local construction workers. The situation is made all the more complex by local content requirements, the obligation to source talent from the country in which the project is built, which is in place in numerous jurisdictions around the world. Further, the most sought after profiles in the energy industry are changing. In addition to the obvious skill set required, such as wind turbine technicians, for example, the sector now needs more data and digital experts. Diversity and inclusion are becoming an essential part of the answer to the question on how to mobilize the necessary workforce for the energy transition. Agility, sound management, and digitization go hand in hand. In the coming years, project developers, owners, and operators will increasingly rely on data and artificial intelligence at every stage, from design to asset management and maintenance. Data science and artificial intelligence also have multiple applications in optimizing renewable energy assets, utilization, and anticipating reliability issues. Scientists, for example, can use weather patterns to forecast energy supply from solar PV assets and wind farms. And through the data collected from sensors of asset condition, utilization, and feedback, again managed by data scientists, predictive maintenance plans can be determined, for example, by predicting future component failure. All this does increase the need for specific worker profiles. Data scientists, having made a fairly recent entrance to the energy job market, are in strong demand now. Nearly 70% of data science teams within the energy companies were created in the last 5 years, and today 40% of companies find it very difficult to hire data scientists with the required skills. While women make up 39% of the global labor force, they account for just 16% of the energy sector. At management level, the numbers are even lower. The barriers women face in the energy sector are similar to those they face elsewhere in the economy, but the relative absence from the sector is clearly fueled in large part by gender-biased beliefs about occupations. Attracting more women to the energy industry is an obvious way to grow the clean energy workforce. By raising awareness of opportunities, more young women could be attracted into STEM and technical roles, thereby plugging part of the gap. However, this is an effort that has to start already in schools and should be further developed at higher education via education programs led by female role models. And with that, I hand back over to Jörg.
Thank you, Stefan, Ulrike, and Christian. This report began with a stark warning. The current pace of action on climate is insufficient, and that the speed of change required to turn things around will need to be remarkable. The will to effect this change, I think, is largely there. The view on how best to get there, broadly a massive scale-up in renewables capacity, is also widely shared by the industry and by policymakers. What is really lacking in many cases is an in-depth understanding of the real practical barriers that the industry is facing. It is those barriers that are preventing us in really progressing. All those barriers that we've seen throughout this presentation are complex, but they're not unsurmountable. The progress, if you look back into the last decades, has already been unimaginable compared to previous ones. So collaboration and trust between the industry actors and the government will take that further so we can see stronger progress in the years to come. So to come back to the beginning of the webinar and to end this with a positive message, it can be done and it must be done. But what I think needs to be clear to everybody, the time to act is now. Now, before we move to the Q&A session, we would like to give an enormous thank you to all the 800 contributors to our report, and especially, of course, to our C-level interviewees, Jonathan Cole from Korea Generation, Anne-Laure Chamat from Siemens Energy, Andrea Lovato from Aqua Power, Yang Yun from CNOOC, Thomas Bröström from Shell, and last but definitely not least, Salvatore Bernabei from Enel Green Power. Without the deep insights and open sharing of all those people, of course, this study would not have been possible. So big thank you to all those hundreds of people. And with that, we are coming to the end of the regular webinar, and we are now, of course, open to answer some questions. And we've been collecting a little bit the questions that were shared throughout the last half an hour, and we'll see how far we get, but we've got a few minutes left to answer some of them. So I've got a first question here for Christian, which is, I'm reading out here, I agree with the results of the survey, especially the permitting constraint the industry is going through, generating a big bottleneck in many countries. However, I also think that financing might become a concern. If not already, what are your thoughts? Christian?
Thank you, Jörg. Yeah, I completely agree. I think financing, in my opinion, is already becoming a concern. We all know central banks right now within the globe are raising interest to fight against inflation, and it's something that it's needed, right? We need to fight against inflation. However, one of the major consequences within this needed monetary policy is that borrowing money is a lot more expensive than it used to be. Remember just some months ago, right? The amount of liquidity for years, right, that the market has been experiencing at extremely low interest, right? So yeah, I couldn't agree more. Financing is becoming a concern when modeling a project that, for instance, has been delayed. And since we were talking about permitting, let's assume that a project has been delayed because of permitting, right? So what can happen in nowadays environment? You know, a developer that started 3 years ago to develop its project with some financing conditions, now that probably, you know, the project might come to a ready-to-build status, the new financing conditions have changed, right, because of higher interest. Could this become an additional delay? Yes and no, right? Because some, you know, clients that we work with are capable to find ways to overcome this situation, but others won't, right? And the classical project financing structure might, you know, they might take the decision to wait a bit more until conditions improve. So definitely, yes, I think financing is already a concern.
Thank you, Christian. I've got another question here for Ulrike. Reading out again, it is astonishing that the industry is almost 50-50 divided on their view if we are on track to deliver the 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris goals. One blocking point cited was lack of available and feasible project sites. What would need to happen to change this?
Interesting question. Thank you for the question. Well, I mean, there are a few ways actually to increase the amount of feasible project sites. And of course, I mean, this varies across geographies, across countries. But for sure, there are some of those with common themes. So For instance, just the process for indicating available and feasible sites in some of the countries takes very long. So sometimes the processes are quite complex. In some countries, you can actually see that the criteria setting is rather strict, and often this is set up with relevant authorities that simply don't have the capacity to cope with the increased workload, because some simply were not prepared to work on accelerating the energy transition. So what we could see, for instance, is simplifying the process, adapting criteria by taking into account, for instance, the decades of experience that is now available with wind farm installations, but also PV power plants. But also, of course, enabling or even really request communities to take direct decisions and indicate a certain amount of sites, for instance, could be an idea. So this could help to distribute also, coming back to the previous point, the workload on authority level in some of the countries at least. But important is, of course, in particular in the communities, also to drive public awareness in order to get relevant support and to avoid controversy as much as possible. In the end, we need to acknowledge renewables will play a significant role in the energy transition. And in order to meet the 1.5 degree Paris goals, basically, this will be through renewables. And in addition, renewables are actually considered as distributed energy sources. So this means that it will require the commitment from every single community actually and city to point out feasible sites and to contribute to the energy transition. I think important is that energy transition is not taking place somewhere out in the world, but it actually has to be implemented rather locally and lived in a more global sense.
Thank you, Ulrike. Thank you. Got another question here, maybe for Stefan to take, which reads, floating offshore wind and floating solar were mentioned as key enabling technologies to accelerate the pace of the transition during the presentation. What is needed to scale this sector up at a much faster pace?
Thank you, Jörg. Very, very interesting question. In fact, I think probably this requires a lot of the points that have been pointed out or raised in the energy transition report. To go a little bit more into detail, I would say innovation, continued innovation and R&D to improve the technology, reduce the costs, and increase the efficiency. Another important point is government support to provide incentives and framework and encourage investment specifically in floating and floating offshore wind and floating solar in this case. One point is collaboration. I think collaboration between industry, government, and academia can help drive the innovation and accelerate the development of the sector. There's still a lot that can be done on that space. One point maybe that I think is very important for the floating offshore wind sector in particular is infrastructure. Infrastructure in the sense of port and harbor infrastructure will be key as an enabler for offshore wind in general, but also specific requirements are there for floating offshore wind. That will be a key element. Not to forget grid infrastructure in the wider sense. We need to make sure that the grid is ready to accept the amount of power that comes from all these new projects that we envision, both offshore solar or offshore floating wind and other renewables, obviously. One important point also mentioned by Ulrike, I think, is public awareness. Increased public awareness and support from local communities is very important to drive demand for floating offshore wind projects, also for floating solar, because if we don't do that, what we've seen a lot in the past is that actually many offshore wind projects are being held up by local communities who give the veto or don't agree, and then these projects face a delay that can range from months into years. So raising the public awareness, the benefits of this technology, especially with the local communities, I think is a critical point for these two technologies to grow even further. And finally, two more points. One is demo projects. I know there is already a series of demo projects out there, both on floating offshore wind and on floating solar. However, I think more can be done. More can be done to show how this technology works, to prove the viability and the benefits of both these technology. And finally, a point very much related to the workforce mobilization topic that I was mentioning before. I think the development of a skilled workforce to design, build, and operate both floating offshore wind farms and floating solar would be key. And this starts with attracting more people to the educational paths of these technologies, into the technical paths of universities, etc., to ramp up and close this huge gap that is there for renewable energy in general, but especially for these two technologies, which are sort of at the forefront and at the early stages of development within the renewable spectrum. So I think packaging all these together would probably be a good push to significantly scale up the deployment of these two technologies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan. We've got time for a few more questions which came in. We've got another question here for Christian. Namely, we've discussed that improving at the EU level permitting, but what do you think can be done for accelerating permitting processes within the local authorities?
Good one. Yeah, because that made me remember my previous experience as a developer, right? And I would say the number one answer here would be local authorities need more resources, right? And there are more. I'll be thinking more, but the number one is more resources. I still remember, right, presenting all your documentation for, no need to name the region or country, right, but presenting all your documentation for a permit and get an answer from the local authorities saying, look, these are all the amount of projects that I need to review, and I'm the only one reviewing this, right? So that's obviously a bottleneck that needs to be solved, and even more, right, when a specific region that there's an engineer reviewing all that documentation gains experience, right, and eventually, you know, they want to change topics, they need to restart again that process, right? So, you know, I would say number one, resources. Other additional things that can be done is clearly have a clearer and a more transparent process. Sometimes, you know, developers face issues that they never know when things, you know, will be approved. So, you know, defining clear timelines and deadlines, it's going to be crucial, right? And that's what the EU is asking, and that needs to be cascaded down to the overall municipalities. Other, you know, I would say really sharing best practices among the different, you know, regions, right? So whenever there's a region that is doing really well on permitting, why don't, you know, at the politician level, right, to make sure that they group together and discuss on what has been done, so we can leverage that good knowledge to our municipalities. And I think there's others, right, topics that can be done, but the number one, I mean, more resources for sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Christian. I've got another question for Ulrike also, saying, according to the report, scaling up the manufacturing capacities for renewable components such as wind turbines, PV modules, and electrolyzers is a major lever for the acceleration of the energy transition. How could this be achieved more swiftly, Ulrike?
Wow, that's a big question actually, and obviously, I mean that answering this, I think this can go into hours. But maybe I just pick a few topics of what we've seen actually, and also in the discussions with the industry, what we hear very often. Well, I mean, indeed. So in order to facilitate this steep increase in renewables installations, there is high pressure on the supply chains. And for sure, the manufacturing industries will be able to not only have an impact on the reliability of the supply chains, but also even on deployment efficiency. So maybe that actually requires a bit of explanation what is meant by that. Basically, when we look at standardizing relevant components as far as possible, this would already give some significant opportunity to overcome at least some of the challenges to accelerate the energy transition. So for instance, when you look at the transportation of components, such as wind turbines, very big components, as well as installation, looking at installation vessels for offshore wind turbines as an example, coming back also to the example that was provided by Stefan on the infrastructure and harbor. Any need of adaptation to specific components and projects obviously reduces efficiency. So this is something that can be tackled by standardizing. It would also reduce planning uncertainties for vessel owners. And any kind of adaptation increases the time for vessel owners, and for the next project, and it's clear that vessel availability is actually one of the major bottlenecks that we're facing for offshore wind for the next few years. But of course, there are also many other examples related to solar and hydrogen, for instance, where standardization of components would definitely do quite a bit in order to help to increase the efficiency in deployment, and hence also accelerate with that energy transition.
All right. Thank you very much, Ulrike. We've got 5 minutes left, so I'll have maybe one more question to Stefan. Saying here, in the presentation, you very powerfully also show the issues with regard to workforce mobilization. Can you maybe give some insights in what are effective strategies to managing resources across multiple large projects in parallel, and how can organizations ensure that each project receives the necessary attention and resources to succeed?
Yes, thank you, Jörg. So this is a very relevant question, I think, to probably the vast majority of the people we interviewed for this report. So I think the number one strategy or approach to this is prioritization. There needs to be there needs to be the definition of clear priorities for each project and allocation of resources based on the importance and urgency of the project. Obviously, this can help ensure that critical projects receive the attention and resources they need to succeed. Indeed, but it also means that some of the projects may be deprioritized and put on hold. And indeed, that is what we have seen and are seeing developers do. We have seen developers pull out entirely of certain regions around the world just because of the sheer quantity of projects elsewhere. This is really a strong indicator of how acute the resource problem is currently in this sector. Furthermore, obviously, there is good resource planning, right? Developing a resource plan that outlines the resources requirement for each project, personnel, equipment, materials, etc., will help identify potential resource conflicts to ensure that the resources are allocated efficiently. And then there's obviously topics such as project management tools, different project management approaches, et cetera, to manage the situation. You know, and we could go into software tools or all kind of things there. However, the key point I would like to make is that it really depends on the number of projects and the number of resources available. Because when the number of projects is larger than what the in-house resources can manage, then there is an issue. And then one way is to engage external parties in the role of owner's engineers, for example, to be the eyes and ears of the owner on the ground and manage the project. So this is a solution that we have been and that we are seeing happening a lot across the world in renewable energy projects. And here owners engineers can support all along the design phase, the procurement phase, and the construction phase to ensure that the projects are executed on time, on quality, and on cost. So this could be, I would say, is in summary, the situation and the approaches that could be, taken to tackle that issue at the moment.
Thank you, Stefan. All right, we've got only 1 minute left. I actually just want to take one final question, which I'll take myself, because I find it's a good closing point actually for the whole conversation. There was a question about what was the most surprising fact that came out of the survey. So, I mean, whilst Christian, Ulrike, Stefan have been answering the questions, I've been thinking about this for a while. And in fact, the report in many places confirms very strongly some of the working hypotheses we had already. It brought up some topics in a very, very new way also, in order of priority especially. So I think we didn't expect, the government topic being probably so strong as it is. But I think that what in fact for me is the most surprising effect of this report is the sheer conciseness and harmonized answering schemes that we've been seeing. It seems like the industry has a very, very clear and joined up view on what needs to be done and how it needs to be done and what is in there on barriers today that we need to overcome. So there is no doubt that as an energy sector, we know what needs to be done, but we need to get going and we need to remove those barriers and we need to convince governments and administrations to move on and to help us making that happen. That is a surprise, but a very positive surprise, because it means there is a very powerful lobby in this energy sector which knows exactly what they want. And now let's move on. And with that, in order not to overrun on this webinar, I'd like to come to an end. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here today. The webinar will be available as a recording at a later stage. You will, as having joined this webinar, also receive a copy of the report. As you know, today is the official report launch date. So if you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to come back to us. And with that, I'd like to come to an end. Thank you very much. Stay safe, take care, and I hope to see many of you soon in the coming days, weeks, and months. Thank you. Goodbye.